Congratulations. Thanks, everybody. Bill.
Like so? Yes. All right. Hi, I'm Bill Lindenfelser, and my wife Shay and I were lucky enough to be able to go on Rick French's pack, paddle, and ski trip last October to this place that Harry is going to be speaking about in a few minutes. And it was just a wonderful, wonderful trip. I think I saw too that Rick is back there along with a bunch of other folks who have made this very same trip. And if you've ever been on a pack, paddle, and ski trip, it really is an experience of a lifetime, I've got to say. I was also fortunate enough to meet Harry Wolfe on the trip, and when you spend almost 2 weeks hiking with somebody, you start to get to know them a little bit. And the two of us in particular, I think, had a really great time. Harry's an avid hiker, not having done the 46 peaks of the Adirondacks just in the summer, but also in the wintertime. And then a number of other trips too, including another pack, paddle, ski trip to the summit of Kilimanjaro. So this is somebody who is quite serious about his hiking and is going to have a great program for us tonight. So I'm going to pass it on to Harry right now.
Microphone up, can everyone hear me? Excellent. As Bill said, this was a pack, paddle, and ski trip. It occurred a year ago, just a year ago, in October of 2018. And to echo Bill's non-commercial remarks about pack, paddle, and ski, Rick does an excellent job. I've been on 5 trips with him now. And I'm sure many of you have been on trips with him, but if you haven't, you better get going because he's semi-retired. He's not getting any younger. And he's only got a couple dozen trips over the next couple of years. But in any case, Rick does an excellent job, and I heartily endorse his trips. All trips start at the beginning, and we started from Rochester. And you might be interested to know that getting to Nepal is not the easiest thing in the world. It requires 21 hours on airplanes. The longest part of the trip being from Kennedy to a town in China, whose name I believe is pronounced Gangchao. It's the old Canton. It's a little bit hard to pronounce. And some of these names, as I go through this presentation, are extremely difficult to pronounce. But all trips also start with a team. And this was our team. And you can see Bill and Shay. And then next to Shay is Bob. Bob is from Rochester. TJ was from Buffalo. Marlene was from Buffalo. Mike was from Rochester, yours truly, and Tori was from Buffalo. So there were 8 paying customers on this particular trek. The individual here is one of our Sherpa guides. His name was Sanjay, and I'll talk a little bit more about our guides and their stories. So, why did I go? I got a lot of questions before I left on this trip. Harry, why do you want to go to Everest Base Camp? And many of my friends actually had some explanations for me. One of them said, well, Harry, you'll do anything to get high. And he was absolutely right. I love a natural high, which I get from being outdoors. Another friend suggested that I wanted to get closer to God. And again, a very good reason, but I find just being outdoors, being close to God. Someone suggested that I wanted to see a Yeti. And I said, what's a Yeti? So that was another reason for going on this trip. Or I could use George Mallory's quotation when he was talking to a newspaper about why do you climb mountains and why do you want to go to Everest. He said, because it's there. However, I had a different reason for wanting to get close to Everest. And I wanted to walk in the footsteps of ghosts. The ghosts of those folks who have walked to Everest Base Camp, who actually have tried to get to the top, but never came back. And Everest really wasn't on my radar at all until I read John Krakauer's book, Into Thin Air, about the disaster that occurred in 1996. And when that happened, I was just hooked on Everest. And at the time, I had a coworker, and between the two of us, we read every book that was written about the disaster in 1996. And Beck Weather's book, Anatoly Bukharev's book, Ed Vescher's book, David Brashear's book, we could not get enough of Everest. And in fact, in 2000, Beck Weathers came to Buffalo, and we shuffled off to Buffalo, and we listened to his experience firsthand. And after he was finished, we actually had an Everest book. And we rushed up to his table and asked Beck Weathers to sign our Everest book, which he did. And he took the catcher's bit of his hand and put the pen in between the thumb and the rest of his fingers, which were fused together, and signed his name. So that is one of the main reasons why I wanted to see Everest. I wanted to get as close as possible to Everest without having to go to the top, which was never in my wildest dreams something that I would consider doing. But we did see a Yeti. In one of the temples that we went into, they had this Yeti skull, so I presume that Yetis actually do exist. So Nepal, let me tell you a little bit about Nepal. Nepal is considered a country in between. It is squashed between China and India. And Nepal is home to 30 million people, approximately. It is home to 8 of the 10 tallest mountains in the world. Now, Nepal is 1/3 the size of the state of California. It's 5 times smaller than the state of Texas. It's 67 times smaller than the country of the USA. And yet in this little country, 8 of the 10 highest mountains in the world exist. The other 2 happen to be in Pakistan. K2 is the 2nd tallest mountain in the world. That's in Pakistan. And I believe Nanga Parbat is like in the top 10, and that is also in Pakistan. Nepal has had a history of isolationism. Not much has been known about their history, and really until 1949, 1950, its borders were closed, which is why all of the original attempts to the top of Everest occurred from Tibet. Tibet's borders were open at the time, and in 1924, the famous Mallory Irvin expedition to the top of Everest occurred, and they were last seen at 28,000 feet on the side of the mountain when they disappeared in a snowstorm, and we know how that story ends. But as it turns out, China started to meddle in the affairs of Tibet, and Tibet closed its border about the same time that Nepal opens its border, which allows now the mountaineers to forge their way to the existing today base camp. And we all know that in 1953, May 29th, 1953, Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay made the successful ascent of Everest. And 3 days later, in England, Queen Elizabeth was crowned. And I know from talking to someone who was a child at the time in London that was such a momentous occasion. It was like they landed on the moon. The fact that Hillary had been announced as making it to the top of Everest. One other event that occurred in 1953 that's of little note, but it occurred in November. I was born. A wonderful year, 1953. So today, Nepal is supposedly a democratic republic. They have a history of monarchs and ruling families. They actually have gotten over a civil war, which occurred in the early 2000s, and have declared themselves a democratic republic. I did not see much evidence that that democratic republic is working very well, at least from my observations in Kathmandu. So, looking at a map, you got this little country of Nepal right here in the middle, Bhutan over here, Pakistan is up here, but you got this huge China and India actually forms the border actually in between it and Bhutan, and then comes around the other side. So it's a very small country with a lot of high places. Kathmandu. In order to start our trek, we flew into Kathmandu, and Kathmandu is the capital city. There's about 1 million people in Kathmandu itself, a few more million in the surrounding valleys of the Kathmandu Valley, and very much in evidence during our time in Kathmandu is the devastation that occurred a few years ago when the earthquake hit this area of the world. In fact, in reading about it, 9,000 people were killed by this earthquake in Kathmandu, and it went up into the valley and into the mountains, and there was actually an avalanche at base camp, which also killed a number of people at base camp when this earthquake hit. And that was probably my biggest memory, and I have many pictures here to show you of just how much rebuilding is still being done in Kathmandu. Kathmandu is a really hustling, bustling, crowded city. I would say 90% of the people ride motorcycles. And it is incredible to see these motorcycles on every street just inching up closer and closer to wherever they have to get to. There are traffic lights in Kathmandu. None of them were working. Literally, none of them were working. They had some traffic cops at various really busy intersections, but if you're driving in Kathmandu, you're on your own. And in a number of cases, when we were doing our tour, we simply got out of the bus and walked the rest of the way because traffic was just so difficult. Here's the Sears store in Kathmandu. And actually, the people of Kathmandu were friendly, and many store owners selling their wares. It seemed to be relatively peaceful, and but there were animals. There were cows, pigeons, monkeys, more monkeys, monkeys up in the electrical system, and this, take a good look at this. This is the electrical system of Kathmandu. This is mild compared to some of the tangles of wire we saw as we drove around Kathmandu. I believe that when someone needs electrical service, they just run a new wire. And how they figure out where to hook it up to is beyond me. But this is what we saw over the entire city, is this type of electrical wiring. But here's just some of the damage that is still being worked on today. Bricks piled in all different places, and homes which need a lot of work on their structures. This is an inner courtyard. Many of the houses in Kathmandu revolve around an inner central courtyard, and these courtyards were, you got into them through a tunnel. And what was interesting about these areas was that even though a car could not go down some of these alleyways, the motorcycles could. So you were always watching in all directions so that you didn't get hit by a motorcycle. And they would literally drive into these courtyards through the tunnels that we were walking through. But you can get a pretty good sense of how devastating the earthquake was in Kathmandu. And here we are 5 years later, and they still have a ton of work to do, which is why, from my perspective, the government really isn't doing a great job in trying to get things rebuilt. OSHA was on site here. These guys are painting the side of a building, and they're barefoot. They've got their bamboo scaffolding. And I love this guy because he's got his bare feet right against all these wires, which led me to believe that none of them were live. But this was a typical construction technique in Kathmandu. And here's one of those tunnels I was talking about that you would use to get access to the center courtyard. And there's a young little child looking down at us. This is Durbar Square, which is a place where there's many temples. And again, you can see that this area also is heavily damaged and is still in need of rebuilding from the earthquake. I'm not going to try to pronounce that. I don't know how to pronounce that. Nyatopola Temple, perhaps, but this is the tallest temple in Kathmandu. It's a Hindu temple in the pagoda style. Most Hindu pagoda temples were not 5 pagodas tall, this one being the largest, and this is also in Durbar Square. The one thing that really impressed me about Kathmandu was the religion of the people. Kathmandu in Nepal is 90% or 80% Hindu and 10% Buddhist. And yet the Sherpas in the Himalayas pretty much 100% Buddhist. But the peaceful coexistence of these religions was pretty amazing to see. And the biggest Tibetan Buddhist Stupa in Kathmandu is right in the middle of the city. And a very interesting building. This is huge. You're just seeing the top, basically the roof, and then the dome of this stupa. Here's another picture. Everything you see in that picture is part of this stupa. And we were allowed to walk all the way around, and not necessarily inside, but there were a few entrance ways where you could kind of go in, and there'd be incense and a few different altars. Buddhist people from everywhere were walking around. They walk counterclockwise. Actually, they walk clockwise. So they're always going to the left. And all along the bottom here, there are prayer wheels. And you can see the prayer flags. And I'll talk more about those in a second as well. And here's another picture of the outside. It's not a square, it's round. It's in the form of a Buddhist mandala, which is a round circle. And there were monks, there were people selling incense, and just a busy place. But this religion, with its largest stupa, is right here in the middle of Kathmandu, which is 80% Hindu. All around the stupa were various monasteries that you could go into, and you can see the picture of the Dalai Lama here in this particular temple. And then on our trek, as we went from village to village, every village had its own little minor stupa, if you would, of various sizes, various ornateness. And again, we're walking to the left. That's you, Rick. And this one, way up in the mountains. So Buddhist symbols. Buddhist symbols came in 3 different varieties. The first one was the prayer wheels. And the prayer wheels were turned 3 times to the left while you were practicing your Buddhist mantra, Om Mani Padme Hum, hail to the jewel in the lotus. And so prayer wheels came in all shapes. Well, they didn't come in all shapes, they were round, but they came in all sizes. And this particular one was rather large. But they were everywhere along the trek. And again, this was a temple where the prayer wheels were all around the outside of the building. And then prayer flags. Prayer flags are used for prayers being blown into the wind to spread goodwill and compassion to all places. And prayer flags were everywhere high for the most part. They really were not on the ground, but they would be flying from the mountainsides, they would be flying from buildings, and as you can see, they were flying from the stupa. And then mani, carved stones with Sanskrit symbols representing the Buddhist mantra. And again, these were everywhere. These were mani stones, a whole line of them. This was one big rock with the Sanskrit symbols. And again, whenever we came upon one of these, you went around to the left. Hinduism. I'm not trying to conduct a religious course here, but Hinduism has 1 billion followers in India and Nepal. And what I thought was interesting is that the religion itself has no formal creed or universal governing organization. But they do have 3 major deities, and they're all aspects of one ultimate reality. And this is the sacred site in Kathmandu for Hindus. Pashupatinath, something like that. This picture is actually a picture of a postcard because it really shows the entire area. The temple itself is over here, and these are various monuments. And flowing through the center here is the Bagmati River. And the Bagmati River is considered a holy river because it flows into the Ganges. And what we observed when we were there was a whole lot of Hindus just kind of hanging around. There were some folks playing music, and I guess this is what was done on a day-to-day basis. But the temple itself was not open to anyone who was not a Hindu, so all we could do was look inside from afar. But what was interesting to me is the Hindus cremate their dead, and this was a family awaiting the cremation of one of their loved ones. And there were cremations going on the whole time we were there, and I was a little concerned, can I take a picture of this? And I was told, no problem. And so the body is cremated, and the ashes are pushed into the Bagmati River, and the ashes are taken down to the Ganges. And as I said, it got dark, but the cremations just were continuing as we were walking around. One other place that we went to that I thought was extremely interesting was a Tonka painting school. And Tonka painting is painting that started in the 13th, 14th century. And it actually is a Buddhist religious art form. And it was thought that it was easy to roll these Tonka paintings up because they were made of cloth, and they could be carried from place to place for teaching or for worship or for decoration. And we had the opportunity to go into this Tonka painting school and observe these students who were in the process of their paintings. And so they would go back here, they would put an outline on the cloth, and then bit by bit they would paint it in. And in order to become a master Tonka painter, it would take years and years for you to get to the point where you would be able to call your paintings masterpieces. This was a whole family in one room working on their Tonka paintings. And they would sit there for hours just brushing each brushstroke into their paintings. And we were brought up to a showroom, and I decided to buy a student painting. Student paintings were not very technical, but this one looked great to me, and it only cost me 30 bucks. And I brought it home, and it cost me 3 times that much to frame it, but it's a great souvenir of the Tonka painting. A couple of other folks on our trek purchased some Tonka paintings, and I'm sure they hang proudly in their houses as well. So let's talk about the trek. And we need to talk about the most dangerous airport in the world when we talk about the trek to Everest Base Camp. Lukla has a 1,700-foot runway. It's actually more like a paved driveway. Edmund Hillary had this built back in 1964. And at the time, it was just a dirt road runway. And it was only paved in 2001. And if you read Into Thin Air, back in 1996, the way to get to Lukla was by Russian helicopter. They really weren't flying planes into Lukla like they do today. Today, everyone who's going on an Everest base trek flies into the Lukla airport. The problem with the Lukla airport is not that it's that dangerous for these pilots who know how to land on 1,700 feet of asphalt, but the weather can delay takeoff and landings to such an extent that you could be stuck at Lukla for a week. And while we experienced some delay, we did get out when we were supposed to on that particular day. I shouldn't say we got out when we were supposed to. We had no idea when we were going to take off. We had a ticket and we had a flight number. And we sat in the airport from 6 in the morning to about 1 in the afternoon before we took off for Lukla. The flight itself was only 35 minutes, but there's no radar, there's no air traffic control, there's no lights. It's visual flight only. And just this past May, a plane crashed on takeoff. It was empty except that it crashed into a couple of helicopters which were parked right on the side of the runway. Kind of hard to describe this runway, but These are the planes that used the Lukla airport. And I believe there were 16 of us in the plane. I wish this video was working. I'm standing on the side of the runway when this plane came in, but unfortunately my video is not working. But you can see the nice fence here, but the path is literally right here. I mean, where in the US can you get that close to a plane landing? And this is what the runway looks like from the top. So, at 1,700 feet, there's a 12% grade coming up, and then a solid wall right here. On the other end, there's a 2,000-foot straight drop. So you either take off or you don't. You either land or you don't. So quite a spot. That's probably the most dangerous part of the trek, is the Lukla airport. And again, this would be a video if it worked. But the Nepalese name for Everest is Sagarmatha. So we were entering Sagarmatha National Park, and we were at the Tenzing Hillary Airport in Lukla. And there we are again, all smiles, getting ready for our trek. Down here is the second of our 3 Sherpas, that was Nawang. And we'll talk more about him too. And the first thing we did, it was time for tea. I drank more tea in 2 weeks than I've drank in my entire life. Tea was the beverage of choice. Milk tea, lemon tea, black tea, butter tea, any kind of tea that you can imagine, that's what we drank. So, never really got tired of it, but we drank a lot of tea. So here's Bob, and those are our 3 Sherpas. So we have Sanjay, we have Nawang, and we have Lukla. And Lukla was our head Sherpa, or Siddhar. And Sanjay didn't speak any English, so communication with Sanjay was basically a smile or a pat on the back, but he was always smiling, always jovial. And he generally was the Sherpa who was leading our little trek to base camp. Nawang, I'm not quite sure how old Sanjay was, but Nawang was in his mid-30s, a carpenter by trade, has 2 children, and was here because I believe Rick, did you know Nawang, or was he part of, just part of the group that Lukla had brought with him?
He's been with me before a few times.
That's what I figured, so.
It's the sponsorship with him, training, guy training for safety.
Gotcha. And then Lukla. Lukla, mid-50s, lives in Portsea, which is a town we visited on our trek. Sanjay and Nawang did not live in the Himalayas. I believe they were living in Katmandu Valley. But Lukla has been on top of Everest 6 times, and that is his, up to now, main occupation. And Lukla's house was heavily damaged in the earthquake. And in order for him to be able to purchase supplies, get him flown in by helicopter to his remote village, he actually had retired but needed to unretire so he could continue to lead Everest trips to earn the money he needed to completely rebuild his house. Lukla had great personality, and he was an excellent guide and very caring for one of the individuals on our trip who got a little sick towards the end. These were our porters. So on the trek, as trekkers, we carried a day pack. And in the day pack pretty much was anything we wanted, rain gear and a few snacks, but we were staying in Himalayan tea houses all the way up on our trek, and I have pictures of those. So our porters would carry our sleeping bag and extra clothes that we had along with us. And Sagamotha National Park has a toll booth. There are permits that are required. There's money that needs to be paid in order to make the trek. I don't expect you to be able to read this, but this is the map of various routes to Everest Base Camp and other base camps in this area. But Lukla's down here. Pakding was night number 1. Namche Bazaar was night 2 and 3. Kumjung, night 4. Portsea, night 5. Dingboche, night 6 and 7. Boche, night 8. Gorge Shep, night 9. Base camp is over there. So we reached base camp on the 9th day of our hike. So what obstacles besides Lukla Airport did we have to encounter? Well, there were multiple suspension bridges, which were an acquired taste and very scary initially. These bridges were very long, very rickety, and as I said, it took a while to get steady legs on those bridges. There were streams to cross, many rocks, yaks, horses, donkeys, dung, and dust. So every day, this was an occasion, probably 10 to 12 times you have to get out of the way for the donkey trains, the yak trains, because this is the way that supplies were brought up and down the Himalayan valley. And they would have bells on them, so we got pretty Pavlovian. Once we could hear bells coming down the trail, everyone knew to step aside. Because you really didn't want to be in the way, because they didn't care. They were going to walk right over you. Now, yaks are a major animal in the Himalaya, but not all yaks are yaks. Down below 12, 13,000 feet, the yaks are actually crossbred with cattle, and they are what we would see lower down, and I don't know how to pronounce those words. So these are not yaks, but these are the crossbreeds, because we're down still pretty low, and again, stepping aside and getting ready to actually go into the park here through this gate. And we followed the Dukosi River, which is the Milk River, for quite a ways up into the valley. And here you can see what it was like. You did not want to be on one of these bridges when there was a yak train or a donkey train coming across. There literally was no room for anyone else. And this gives you another idea of what it looked like to cross one of these bridges. And here is a tea house. This is what we stayed in each night as we did our trek. And this was a way that Sherpas developed to supplement their income and to take care of the hundreds and hundreds of trekkers that were on the Everest Base Camp trek. The world is trekking to base camp, and these tea houses were certainly a little bit more comfortable, closer to Lukla, but as you got higher and higher, they got a little bit more rustic. In general, there was no heat, and some had running water, most did not. So this was what a typical room looked like. 2 beds, and this particular tea house actually had a bathroom inside. Most of them were down the hall. Most of them were of the self-bailing type, where you use the bucket on the right to flush the toilet. But the views would just get better and better as we continued our trek up to base camp. Heat was provided in the main dining room, and the heat was generated by dried yak dung. And this gentleman is putting the dung into the fire. And again, as we got higher and higher in altitude, it got colder and colder. And during the evening, everyone would have their chairs around the central furnace there because there was no heat anywhere else in the building. But this was so much nicer than being outside in tents. And the farmers would collect the yak dung, and they would put it just about anywhere they could find to get it drying in the sun so that they would have their heat source. And there were all sorts of beautiful waterfalls. The Dukosi River, again, was just a beautiful walk along the river. And you can see up here 2 bridges. This bridge here is out of service, so everyone's going across this bridge. And that was about 150 feet above the Dukosi River. And that was the beginning of the major climb up to a town called Namche Bazaar. One thing that I would tell you is that the trail was pretty immaculate. The maintenance along the trail, there were garbage cans, there were recycling cans, and this gentleman is carrying all sorts of plastic bottles in that bundle back down to Lukla to be taken to Katmandu and recycled. So here's the village of Namche Bazaar, probably the major village on the entire Everest trek, built into the side of a mountain. This actually is a tourist area where, if you were so inclined, you could take a helicopter into here, because the helicopters were buzzing around all the time. There are some major hotels building right here in Namche Bazaar. But this village was built on a hill. No matter where you walked, you were walking either uphill or downhill. But in a spectacular location, literally built into the side of a mountain. And we stayed at the Yak Motel. And I don't know whether that's a yak or a crossbreed, but I called everything a yak after a while. And there's our porters hanging out. And this is what they look like when they had stuff on their backs. They used these head harnesses, and they worked extremely hard. So we walked into this next village. This is Kumjum village, and immediately you can see the stupa. And inside here were prayer wheels, and religion was in evidence everywhere we went. And our Sherpas, especially Sanjay, were extremely reverent, and they were just in touch with nature. And it was pretty amazing to see. But this is a typical village. Again, they're all kind of built into the sides of mountaintops. A little bit of advertising. You stay here, you can see good view from here. And this was a tea house. This was actually a farmer who had converted his house into a tea house to take advantage of the trekkers coming through town. And he had his yaks right there in the yard. And while we were in Kumjung village, we went to see some friends of Rick's. This is Dami, or Doma and Kami. And they invited us into their house and proceeded to make us lunch. And this was quite an experience to actually be in Sherpa's house and to be treated to a lunch built on their modern stove. And this was the result. Those are mau maus. These are kind of dumplings filled with vegetables, carrots, French fries, a little lettuce. That was probably the best meal that I had on this trek. This temple, this monastery, is in Dami and Kami's house. It is a tradition for the Sherpa people to devote an entire room to their Buddhist religion and beliefs. And everything in here stands for something. And in addition, there's 109 different books back here, all representing their Buddhist religion. It was, again, pretty amazing to see the devotion that they have. But on with the trek, and we continued to move higher and higher. Air got a little bit thinner, but the scenery got even more spectacular. This over here is the village of Portsi. And as you can see, we're kind of on a high spot over here. We had to go all the way down and come back up to get to the village of Portsi. It was about 1,200 feet down, another 1,200 feet back up. But there's a famous mountain over here, that's Ama de Blanc. And that's at 22,000 feet high. It has been climbed many times, and it is ever present for the rest of our trek as we move closer to base camp. And again, get aside, here come the yaks, and the bells would be ringing, and we'd be looking for high ground. You really didn't want to get too close to those horns. They just kind of kept their heads down and kept moving. But and if, in fact, they stopped or started to graze on something, there'd be a Sherpa in the back who would throw a rock at them or have a stick and beat them on the rear end to get them moving again. And as I say, the scenery became more and more spectacular, the vegetation went away, and you were in the middle of these snow-capped mountains. And Sanjay and I are taking a little break here in the sunshine. The weather was spectacular. It was cold at night and probably in the 20-degree range. But as soon as the sun came up, it got quite warm, and you could take a few layers off. But we had no rain in the 3 weeks that we were in Nepal. It was the dry season. And one of our teammates needed a little help one afternoon, and so Rick ordered him a Himalayan Uber. And he got on that and was able to make it to the next town. And this gives you some idea of what the terrain was like. They did have stairs built into some of these hillsides, but typically you had a wall on one side and you had the valley on the other side, and it was quite dusty, and it got to the point where most of us came home with a cough from that dust. And again, here we're leaving Portsi, and there's your Mani stone over here with the Sanskrit symbols, Buddhist mantra. You got a small stupa, and this was a common occurrence. So here was the one of the areas that I was most interested in. These are chortens, memorials, rock memorials to all of the fallen mountaineers who never came back from Everest. And I was particularly interested in looking for the chorten for Scott Fisher and Rob Hall, the two guys who did not make it back in that disaster of 1996. And I did find Scott Fisher's, did not find Rob Hall's. There were dozens and dozens of these chortens in this area, and they were spread out over a wide area. And by that time of the trek, I was kind of tired, and I wasn't interested in looking at every single one to find Rob Hall. Laboche Village, we're getting closer to our ultimate destination. And there's the new Everest Base Camp guest house. And as I said, we're getting a little bit more rustic the further we get up the mountain. And then finally, Gorak Shep. Gorak Shep is at 17,000 feet. We spent one night sleeping at 17,000 feet. But we got to Gorak Shep at about 11 o'clock in the morning. We had lunch, and then it was time to head to base camp. And base camp was a couple miles from Gorak Shep. And this is just a view from Gorak Shep of various mountains. And then finally, the afternoon of our 9th day on the trail, we made it to Everest Base Camp. And there's our group. The interesting thing about being at Everest Base Camp is you cannot see Mount Everest. It is blocked by primarily Nuptse and a couple of other lower peaks. So in order to get the view that I wanted of Everest, the next morning we went and climbed a small peak called Kalapatar. Kalapatar is right outside Gorak Shep as well. And it is 18,500 feet at the top. And so that is the picture I wanted. You're looking at Everest. Over here on the right is Nuptse. This here is just part of a ridge, I believe one of the ridges of Everest. But down in here is your Khumbu icefall, and the Khumbu Glacier making its turn down the valley. This glacier here has receded quite a bit, by the way. That used to go way down the valley, but now it's pretty much stopped right here. And base camp is down here. Base camp is a lunar landscape. I don't know how they set up all the tents that they do, but there's no level ground, there's nothing but rocks, and it sits right down here. Here's a better picture of the Khumbu Icefall. Base camp, glacier. And of course, at the end of the trek, we needed to celebrate, and I believe some rum was broken out, among other things that were available, beer, and we had a nice closing ceremony and dance with our Sherpa guides. And that is the end of the presentation. Is there anything I can answer? Any questions? Yes?
About how many miles did you trek each day?
How many miles did we trek each day? That was very highly variable. There were days where we walked 5 miles. I believe the longest day that I have written in my diary was 12 miles, and that was on the way down. So the total trek from Lukla to base camp is 50 miles. So a total of 100 miles round trip. How many feet is it from the top of Everest to base camp? Base camp is 17,500 feet. Everest is 29,029 feet. Now, you would think that from Lukla, which was at about 9,500 feet, to base camp is 17,005, you would think, okay, that's, you know, we walked 8,000 feet, but what we really did was, it was a constant up and down. So we were going up and down in those valleys, and Mike, who was with us, had a real fancy watch, and he could tell us every day how many feet we went down and how many feet we went up, and my watch goes tick-tock, his does not. You know, so he sent me all of the statistics for every day. And the total ascent that we actually went when we were walking uphill was 23,000 feet for the trek. So that's relatively significant uphill. Yes?
You mentioned the glacier receding. Did you see any other evidence of climate change?
Beyond that particular glacier, I mean, we were walking up that valley for a long time, and you could see where the glacier used to be. It was carved out, but it was dry. There was just a stream running through it. So beyond that, I did not observe any other climate change there.
How did everybody do with the altitude?
Altitude affected us all differently. And the one gentleman who you saw on the Himalayan Uber, the horse, he needed to turn around at 15,000 feet. And the only way to recover from altitude sickness is to go down. And he was my roommate, and the last night that we were together, he was miserable. He was up and down to the bathroom, he was coughing and hacking, and it was unfortunately clear that he was not going to be able to go on. The rest of us all made it to base camp. And by the time we got to the Gorak Shep, the last stop at 17,000 feet, I had pretty much lost my appetite, and I was not eating anything other than a granola bar. And I came back 10 pounds lighter, just because I didn't like the food. You can only eat so many noodles and rice, and it was a vegetarian diet, and I'm a meatosaurus, so, but you really didn't want to eat the yak or anything else that they might be offering. So we all came back with a hacking cough that lasted for weeks. And the woman who was with us from Buffalo, I talked to her subsequently because she was really sick on the way down. She needed a lot of assistance on the 2 days that we spent trying to get back to Lukla Airport. She checked into the emergency room when she got back, told them she was sick, she didn't know what she had, and that she had just come back from Nepal. And they put on hazmat suits at the emergency room because they had no idea what she had. But it turned out she got diagnosed with double pneumonia and sepsis from this trip. So she was probably the sickest of the group, but we all had a cough that just from ingesting the dust and whatever was in the dust, like yak dung and donkey dung. And you had to watch where you stepped because it was quite the trail.
Did you drink anything besides tea? Like, did you drink water at all?
We certainly drank water, but tea was literally the staple. I'm not even sure that, I'm not sure that coffee was available. If it was powdered, but tea.
Filter the water somehow? Or?
Sanjay was our kitchen observer to make sure that everything that was prepared for us was sanitary. So whenever anything was being made for us, food or water, for instance, for our bottles, it generally came out hot, the water, because it was being boiled. And he was in the kitchen at all times, making sure that no shortcuts were being taken with safety for the food that would be served. Yes?
Did you come down the same way you went up, and how many days did it take you to come down?
We came down essentially the same way. We did stay in 2 different towns on the way down, and if we made it up on the 9th day and we did Kalapatar on the 10th day, it took 3 days to get back down from there. Yes?
What was the cost of this trip?
What was the cost of this trip? Well, I flew on China Southern Airlines, which is an absolutely marvelous airline. My round-trip ticket from Rochester to Kathmandu and back was $900. You would have probably guessed more than a couple $1,000, but I flew halfway around the world for $900. And the cost of the trip itself, I don't know whether I want to tell them that, Rick. It was, I think it was about $4 grand-ish, 4,300? 42? 32. So 32 plus 900 was the cost of the trip, other than any souvenirs you may have bought, but everything was included. So once we were there, we weren't taking a lot of money out of our pocket. Did I miss somebody? I'll get there and here. If I go again, how will I prepare more? Number one, I'm not going again. That is a one and done trip, as most of my international trips are. I've seen it, done it, I've got the t-shirt. My preparation for my entire life is I'm a runner. I get up in the morning and I go for a run. And that's how I keep in shape. I do it to this very day. I run 5 or 6 times a week, and I've done nothing else to prepare for anything that I've done from a hiking standpoint. So if I were to do this again, see, the problem with altitude is you and I can go up and we'll be affected entirely differently. There's no way for you to know here how you're going to feel at 15,000, 16,000, or 18,000 feet. And that's the great unknown. You basically go and you hope for the best. Now there is an altitude medicine that you can get prescribed, and that's Diamox. And it was explained to me how Diamox works to counteract the effects of altitude. But Mike is not here, and I forgot what he told me, and he's the doctor, so we'll have to get back to you on that one. I don't remember. But so once we start on the trek, we're taking Diamox every day until you start heading down. And it doesn't necessarily counter-affect all of our symptoms of altitude. There was one back here. Did I get that one? Or? Dave?
Gary, when did you first see Everest looking out?
There were a number of times early on where you got this glimpse of the top of Everest, but it was really far away, and I didn't pay too much attention to it because it was just way too far away. And, someone said, well, that's Everest. I said, okay, well, it's really too far away for me to really appreciate it. So it was Kalapatar where you had to go to get the view of Everest. And that evening before, after we came back from Everest Base Camp, I was really tired, and I didn't think I was going to get up at 6 the next morning to do Kalapatar. And then Mike said something which other people have said to me on past trips. He said, you're never going to come back this way again. So I got up at 6 o'clock and I went to the top of Kalapatar, and I'm glad I did. But that was not necessarily what I wanted to do after we came back from base camp.
How long did it take you before you felt like eating? Halfway down?
I did not feel like eating until I got home. When we got back from Lukla, we spent another day and a half in Kathmandu, and all I wanted to do was drink beer and eat nuts, and that's all I ate for 2 days. So I really didn't eat anything until I got home. And it was just because I didn't like the food. I could find nothing that really... The food is very spicy, and I'm not a spicy kind of guy, so I had trouble with the food.
What was the date of the trip?
It was October, it was the first 3 weeks of October in 2018. We were gone for 3 weeks, from the time we left Rochester till the time we got back. No. Base camp is occupied when they're climbing Everest, which is April and May every year. Otherwise, you're not allowed to sleep at base camp. So you're allowed to visit and you get out. And we spent 30 minutes there and we were out. It was cold, it was windy. Even though the sun was out, it wasn't a very pleasant experience at base camp. They're climbing in April and May because that is the window of opportunity, so to speak, in Everest. For most of the year, the jet stream is blowing straight across the top at 200 miles an hour. And in between the dry season and the monsoon season, the jet stream backs off. And that's why this year, when you saw all those people lined up trying to get to the top of Everest, the weather had kept them socked in for longer than they expected. And when the weather window opened, they all went together. And as a result, the lines that you saw in Everest this past May. But I believe people try to climb it during other months of the year, and they may climb it from the north side, the Tibetan side, but the main Everest season is literally late May. Is when the weather is most advantageous. So that's why Edmund Hillary made it to the top on May 29th. The disaster in 1996 was May something. I think it might have been May 12th, if I'm not mistaken, but that's Everest climbing season. Yes, sir?
If that's base camp on the left, and there's a glacier, what is the route across the glacier?
So, if you, let's go back. All right. So if base camp is here, you're setting up your tents with all of your support staff for about a 6-week stay. And during the time that you're there, the Sherpas are going to lay ladders and ropes to get you up and down the ice fall. The base camp is at 17,500. Camp 1 is just above the ice fall at 19,000 feet. And the mountaineers will go up and down, up and down, up and down. And eventually they'll start making their way up the western Coombe, which is all behind here. Let's see if we can go back. So the route is now hidden all behind Nupsy here. But eventually it gets up over here to the South Col. And they all climb pretty much along the back side of what you're looking at here on Everest. Camp 4 would be just below the South Col. So there's 4 camps, each one successively higher, obviously, and but the mountaineers are just constantly going up and down to get acclimatized to the point where they finally can make that assault on the top. And it's highly dependent on the weather window, and you've seen the pictures. Any other questions? Thank you very much. I appreciate your time. Close to my mouth?
I don't have anything to say. Thank you for